Close your eyes for a moment and imagine this. You're standing on the edge of a frozen fjord in 9th century Norway. The wind howls like a living thing, tearing across the ice with a sound that feels almost sentient. Your breath doesn't just fog, it crystallizes instantly, forming tiny ice needles that hang in the air before your face. The temperature has plunged to 40 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Your fingers ache, your face burns, and yet all around you life continues. Children play, fires burn, ships are being built. Families gather, laugh, and survive. This isn't a story about endurance alone, it's a story about transformation, about how a people turned the most hostile environment on Earth into their greatest advantage. The Vikings didn't just survive the cold, they mastered it, weaponized it, and used it to reshape the medieval world. Tonight, we're going to walk through their world. Not the Hollywood version, with fur-clad warriors shouting in the snow, but the real world, the one where survival was a science, where every decision, what you wore, what you ate, how you slept, was a calculated response to an environment that wanted you dead. We'll explore the frozen landscapes they called home, the ingenious technologies they developed, and the psychological resilience that allowed them to thrive where others would have perished within hours. So settle in, dim the lights. Let the cold creep in just a little, because tonight we're traveling back to a time when winter wasn't just a season, it was a test. And the Vikings passed it with flying colors. Let's start with the land itself. Scandinavia during the Viking Age, roughly 793 to 1066 CE, was not the picturesque winter wonderland you might imagine from travel brochures. It was a brutal, unforgiving expanse of ice, rock, and darkness that stretched from the Arctic Circle down through what we now call Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. The geography alone was enough to break most civilizations. Norway's coastline, jagged and fractured by thousands of fjords, created a landscape where communities were isolated by sheer cliffs and freezing water. Sweden's interior was dominated by dense forests and frozen lakes that could swallow entire settlements under ice. Denmark, though slightly milder, still faced biting winds that swept across flat plains with nothing to slow them down. But it was the climate that truly defined Viking existence. This was the tail end of what climatologists call the medieval warm period, but don't let the name fool you. Warm is relative. In Scandinavia, this meant winters where temperatures regularly dropped to 20, 30, even 40 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. In the far north, near what is now Tromsø, the sun disappeared entirely for months at a time, plunging communities into a darkness so complete that it felt like living inside a cave. The cold wasn't just uncomfortable. It was lethal. Frostbite could claim fingers and toes in minutes. Hypothermia could kill in hours, and yet the Vikings didn't retreat. They didn't migrate south to warmer lands. Instead, they dug in, adapted, and built a civilization that would eventually stretch from North America to the Middle East. The key to understanding their survival lies in recognizing that the Vikings didn't see the cold as an enemy to be defeated. They saw it as a force to be understood, respected, and ultimately harnessed. The frozen seas that isolated them also protected them from invasion. The long winters that made farming difficult also preserved food naturally. The darkness that could drive men mad also taught them patience, storytelling, and the value of community. The landscape itself was a teacher. The fjords, carved by ancient glaciers, created natural harbors that protected ships from storms. The mountains, though treacherous, provided stone for building and ore for metalworking. The forests, dark and dense, offered timber for construction and fuel for fires. Even the ice itself became a resource, a highway in winter, connecting communities that were separated by water in summer. But the environment wasn't static. It shifted, evolved, and challenged the Vikings constantly. Some winters were mild, allowing for extended farming seasons. Others were catastrophic, with ice forming so thick that ships couldn't launch until late spring. The Vikings learned to read these patterns, to predict the weather not through modern meteorology, but through generations of accumulated wisdom passed down in stories, songs, and sagas. They watched the behavior of animals, the way reindeer moved before a storm, the patterns of migrating birds, the thickness of a bear's winter coat. They studied the sky, noting the color of clouds, the direction of winds, the appearance of auroras. They even developed a sophisticated understanding of ocean currents and ice formation, knowledge that would later allow them to navigate across the North Atlantic to Iceland, Greenland, and eventually North America. This wasn't primitive superstition. It was empirical science, refined over centuries through trial, error, and the harsh consequences of getting it wrong. A Viking farmer who misread the signs and planted too early could lose his entire crop to a late frost. A ship captain who misjudged the ice could find his vessel trapped, his crew starving, his reputation destroyed. The geography of Scandinavia also created distinct regional cultures, each adapted to their specific environment. The Norwegians living along the coast became master sailors and fishermen. The Swedes in the interior developed sophisticated forestry and hunting techniques. The Danes, with more arable land, focused on agriculture and animal husbandry. But all of them shared one common challenge: the cold. And it was in meeting this challenge that they developed the technologies, strategies, and mindset that would define the Viking Age. Because survival in such an environment required more than just physical toughness. It required innovation, cooperation, and a willingness to think differently about every aspect of daily life. Walk into a Viking longhouse on a winter night, and you'd immediately understand why these structures were architectural marvels disguised as simple buildings. From the outside, they looked almost primitive. Long, low structures with turf roofs and wooden walls. But step inside, and you'd find yourself in a carefully engineered survival machine designed to trap heat, manage smoke, and house not just people, but the animals that kept them alive. The typical longhouse stretched anywhere from 40 to 250 feet in length, depending on the wealth and status of the family. But size wasn't the most important feature. What mattered was the design, every element carefully calculated to maximize warmth and minimize heat loss. The walls were thick, often 2 to 3 feet of layered construction. The outer layer was vertical wooden planks, usually oak or pine, sealed with tar to keep out wind and moisture. Behind this was a layer of woven branches, creating an air gap that acted as insulation. Then came the inner wall, another layer of planks, often decorated with carvings or painted designs. This triple-layer system created dead air spaces that trapped heat far more effectively than a single wall ever could. But the real genius was in the roof. Viking builders didn't just throw some thatch over wooden beams and call it done. They created a complex, multi-layered system that could withstand the weight of snow, shed rain, and insulate against the cold. The base was a framework of massive timber beams, often carved from single trees. Over this went layers of birch bark, which was naturally waterproof. Then came thick layers of turf, living grass and soil that could be 2 to 3 feet deep. This turf roof wasn't just insulation. It was a living, breathing ecosystem. The grass continued to grow, its roots binding the soil together and preventing erosion. In summer, wildflowers bloomed on the roof, creating a beautiful and functional green space. In winter, the snow that accumulated on top added another layer of insulation, while the turf beneath prevented heat from escaping. Inside, the layout was equally sophisticated. The center of the longhouse was dominated by a long fire pit, running down the middle of the main hall. This wasn't a simple campfire. It was a carefully designed heating and cooking system, with stones arranged to radiate heat long after the flames died down. The smoke rose naturally, drawn upward by the heat, and escaped through a series of small openings in the roof, positioned to create a draft that pulled smoke out while preventing cold air from rushing in. Along the walls were raised platforms about 2 feet high, where people slept, worked, and lived. These platforms served multiple purposes. They kept people off the cold floor where the coldest air settled. They provided storage space underneath for food, tools, and supplies. And they created distinct zones within the longhouse: sleeping areas, work areas, storage areas, all within one large room. But here's where it gets really interesting. Vikings didn't live alone in their longhouses. They shared the space with their animals. Cows, sheep, goats, and horses were brought inside during the winter, housed in stalls at one end of the building. This wasn't just about protecting the animals from the cold. It was a deliberate heating strategy. A single cow generates about the same amount of heat as a 1,000-watt space heater. Multiply that by 5 or 6 animals, and you've got a significant heat source that requires no fuel, produces no smoke, and provides the added benefit of fresh milk, wool, and companionship. The animal's body heat would rise, warming the human living spaces above and around them. In return, the animals benefited from the shelter and the warmth of the human fires. This arrangement required careful management. The animal area had to be separated enough to contain the smell and waste, but connected enough to allow heat transfer. Vikings solved this with partial walls, raised floors, and strategic placement of doors and ventilation holes. They also developed sophisticated manure management systems, regularly cleaning the stalls and composting the waste for use as fertilizer in the spring. The floor itself was another marvel of practical engineering. Rather than bare earth, which would be cold and muddy, Vikings created layered floors. The base was compacted clay or stone, providing a solid, moisture-resistant foundation. Over this went layers of sand or gravel for drainage. Then came wooden planks in the main living areas, or packed earth mixed with straw in the animal sections. The floor was regularly refreshed with new layers of straw, rushes, or pine needles, which absorbed moisture, provided insulation, and could be easily replaced. Lighting was a constant challenge during the long winter darkness. Vikings used a combination of methods to illuminate their homes. Oil lamps, fueled by fish oil or animal fat, provided steady light but required constant maintenance. Torches made from resinous pine wood burned brightly but quickly, and candles made from beeswax or tallow were expensive but long-lasting. Most households used all three, depending on the task and the time of day. But perhaps the most ingenious aspect of Viking architecture was its flexibility. Longhouses weren't permanent structures in the modern sense. They were designed to be modified, expanded, and even relocated if necessary. Walls could be moved, rooms could be added. Entire sections could be rebuilt without tearing down the whole structure. This adaptability was crucial in an environment where needs changed with the seasons, where families grew and shrank, where economic fortunes rose and fell. The construction process itself was a community effort. Building a longhouse required hundreds of trees, thousands of hours of labor, and the coordinated effort of dozens of people. Timber had to be felled, shaped, and transported. Turf had to be cut, carried, and carefully layered. Stones had to be gathered for foundations and fire pits. It was a massive undertaking that reinforced social bonds and created obligations that lasted for generations. And when the work was done, when the last turf was laid and the first fire lit, the longhouse became more than just a building. It became the center of Viking life, a place of warmth, safety, and community in a world that offered precious little of any of those things. Now let's talk about clothing, because this is where Viking ingenuity really shines. Forget the leather and fur you see in movies. Real Viking cold-weather clothing was a sophisticated, multi-layered system that rivaled modern technical gear in its effectiveness. The foundation of Viking warmth was wool, not just any wool, but specifically processed, carefully selected wool from breeds of sheep that had been developed over centuries for cold climates. These sheep produced wool with unique properties: long fibers that trapped air, natural oils that repelled water, and a crimp that created insulating pockets. But raw wool wasn't enough. Vikings developed complex processing techniques to maximize its insulating properties. After shearing, the wool was washed, carded, and spun into yarn. But here's where it gets interesting. They created different types of yarn for different purposes. Tightly spun yarn for outer layers that needed to be wind-resistant. Loosely spun yarn for inner layers that needed to trap air. Even the direction of the spin mattered. Z-twist for some applications, S-twist for others. The weaving process was equally sophisticated. Viking looms could produce fabrics of varying densities, from loose, airy weaves for base layers to tight, almost felt-like weaves for outer garments. Some fabrics were fulled, a process of washing and beating that caused the fibers to mat together, creating a dense, water-resistant material that was warmer than the original weave. The layering system itself was brilliant. The base layer, worn directly against the skin, was a loose-fitting linen or fine wool tunic. Linen might seem like an odd choice for cold weather, but it had a crucial property. It wickeded moisture away from the skin. In extreme cold, sweat is your enemy. It conducts heat away from your body and can freeze, creating a layer of ice against your skin. The linen base layer prevented this by moving moisture outward to the next layer. Over the base layer came a thicker wool tunic, often knee-length with long sleeves. This was the primary insulating layer, and it was here that Vikings showed their understanding of heat retention. The tunic was cut loose enough to trap air but fitted enough at the neck, wrists, and waist to prevent heat loss. Some tunics had drawstrings or ties at these critical points, allowing the wearer to adjust the fit based on activity level and temperature. Next came the trousers, which were more complex than you might think. Viking legwear consisted of two separate pieces, essentially long tubes of fabric that were tied to a belt at the waist. This design allowed for easy adjustment and repair, but more importantly, it created air pockets around the legs that provided insulation. The trousers were often made from a tightly woven wool that resisted wind while still allowing some breathability. Over the trousers came leg wraps, long strips of wool fabric that were wound around the lower legs from ankle to knee. These served multiple purposes. They protected the vulnerable lower legs from wind and snow. They provided compression, which helped maintain circulation in the extremities. And they could be easily removed and dried if they got wet, something that was impossible with sewn-in pant legs. The outer layer was where Vikings really showed their engineering prowess. The cloak was the most important piece of cold weather gear, and it was far more sophisticated than a simple blanket with a hole in it. Viking cloaks were carefully shaped, often semicircular or rectangular, and made from the finest, most tightly woven wool available. The best cloaks were fulled to the point of being almost waterproof, capable of shedding rain and snow while still allowing moisture from the body to escape. But the real genius was in how the cloak was worn. It was fastened at the right shoulder with a brooch, leaving the right arm free for work or fighting. The left side could be wrapped around the body, creating multiple layers of fabric over the chest and back, the areas most vulnerable to heat loss. In extreme cold, the cloak could be pulled over the head like a hood, or wrapped around the entire body like a sleeping bag. Footwear was another critical element. Viking shoes and boots were made from leather, but not modern thin leather. They used thick, often double-layered leather that had been treated with oils and fats to make it water-resistant. The soles were sometimes reinforced with wood or extra layers of leather, providing insulation from the frozen ground. But here's the clever part. Vikings didn't wear their shoes tight. They left room for thick wool socks, sometimes multiple pairs, and even for stuffing with dried grass or moss. This created an insulating air pocket around the foot, while also allowing for some moisture absorption. When the grass got wet, it could be removed and replaced, something impossible with a tightly fitted boot. Mittens were preferred over gloves because they allowed the fingers to share warmth. Viking mittens were often made with a separate thumb, but kept the other 4 fingers together. They were lined with fur or extra wool, and some had long cuffs that extended up the forearm, overlapping with the sleeve to prevent any gap where cold air could enter. Headwear was crucial because the human body loses a significant amount of heat through the head. Vikings wore close-fitting wool caps, often with ear flaps that could be tied under the chin. Some caps were lined with fur for extra warmth. In extreme conditions, they would wrap a wool scarf around the face, leaving only the eyes exposed. But perhaps the most ingenious aspect of Viking cold weather clothing was its adaptability. Every piece could be added or removed based on activity level and temperature. Working hard and generating heat? Remove the cloak. Sitting still on watch? Add extra layers. This flexibility was crucial because overheating was just as dangerous as freezing. Sweat could soak your clothing, and when you stopped moving, that moisture would freeze. Vikings also understood the importance of keeping clothing dry. Wet wool loses much of its insulating properties, so they developed techniques for drying clothes even in freezing conditions. Garments were hung near fires, but not too close. Scorched wool is useless wool. They were beaten to remove ice crystals. They were even buried in snow, which sounds counterintuitive but actually works. The dry snow absorbs moisture from the fabric. The maintenance of clothing was a constant year-round task. Wool had to be cleaned, repaired, and treated with oils to maintain its water resistance. Leather had to be conditioned to prevent cracking. Seams had to be checked and reinforced. This wasn't just busy work, it was survival maintenance, as critical as sharpening weapons or repairing ships. And here's something that often gets overlooked. Vikings understood that staying warm wasn't just about physical insulation. It was about managing your body's heat production. They knew that eating high-calorie foods before going out in the cold would help maintain body temperature. They knew that staying active generated heat, but that too much activity would cause sweating. They knew that alcohol, despite making you feel warm, actually increased heat loss and was dangerous in extreme cold. This knowledge wasn't written down in textbooks. It was passed down through generations, taught by parents to children, shared among communities, and refined through the harsh consequences of getting it wrong. Because in the Viking world, a mistake in cold weather clothing wasn't just uncomfortable, it could be fatal. Let's talk about food. Because in the frozen north, what you ate wasn't just about nutrition. It was about generating the internal heat that kept you alive. Vikings needed to consume between 3,000 and 5,000 calories per day during winter, far more than modern sedentary lifestyles require. And they needed those calories to come from specific types of food that would provide sustained energy and heat production. The Viking diet was built around fat, not the lean, protein-focused diet we often associate with warriors, but a high-fat, calorie-dense eating pattern that modern nutritionists are only now beginning to appreciate. Fat provides more than twice the calories per gram as protein or carbohydrates, and it burns slowly, providing sustained heat production over hours. Fish was the foundation of this diet, but not the way you might think. Vikings didn't eat fresh fish fillets. They ate fatty fish, herring, mackerel, salmon, preserved in ways that concentrated the fat content. Dried fish, a staple of the Viking diet, was made by hanging fish in the cold, dry air until it lost most of its moisture, but retained its fat. The result was a food that could be stored for months, required no cooking, and provided massive amounts of calories in a small package. But the real calorie bomb was fermented fish. Vikings would bury fish in the ground, allowing it to ferment over months. The process broke down proteins and concentrated fats, creating a food that was incredibly nutrient-dense. Yes, it smelled terrible. Yes, it was an acquired taste. But it provided the kind of sustained energy that could keep a person warm and active through a long winter day. Meat was consumed in large quantities, but again, the fattiest cuts were prized. Pork, with its high fat content, was more valuable than lean venison. Mutton, especially from older sheep that had built up fat reserves, was preferred over lamb. And every part of the animal was used: the organs, the bones, the fat, even the blood. Bone marrow was considered a delicacy, and for good reason. It's almost pure fat, incredibly calorie-dense, and rich in nutrients. Vikings would roast bones until they cracked, then suck out the marrow. Bone broth, made by simmering bones for hours, extracted every bit of nutrition and created a warming, fatty liquid that could be drunk throughout the day. Dairy products were crucial, but not in the form we might expect. Fresh milk was consumed when available, but most dairy was preserved as butter, cheese, or a fermented product called skyr. Viking butter wasn't the pale, sweet butter we know today. It was made from the cream of grass-fed cows, giving it a deep yellow color and a rich, almost gamey flavor. And it was consumed in quantities that would shock modern dietitians, sometimes a pound or more per person per day during the coldest months. Cheese was made in massive wheels and aged for months or even years. The aging process concentrated the fat and protein while reducing moisture, creating a food that was shelf-stable and incredibly calorie-dense. Some Viking cheeses were so hard they had to be shaved with a knife or grated before eating. Skyr, a fermented dairy product similar to yogurt but thicker and higher in protein, was a staple food. It could be eaten plain, mixed with berries or honey, or used as a base for other dishes. The fermentation process made it easier to digest and increased its nutritional value, while the high protein content helped maintain muscle mass during the long winter months when physical activity was reduced. Grains played a supporting role, but they were prepared in ways that maximized their caloric value. Barley and oats were the primary grains, often made into porridge with added butter, milk, or cream. This wasn't the watery oatmeal of modern diets. It was a thick, rich mixture that could stick to your ribs and provide sustained energy for hours. Bread was dense and heavy, made from coarsely ground flour mixed with seeds, nuts, and sometimes even dried fish or meat. A single slice could provide several hundred calories, and it was often eaten with generous amounts of butter or cheese. But Vikings also understood the importance of micronutrients, even if they didn't have the scientific language to describe them. They consumed large amounts of organ meats, liver, heart, kidneys, which are rich in vitamins and minerals. They ate fermented foods, which provided beneficial bacteria for gut health, and they consumed wild plants and berries when available, providing vitamin C and other nutrients that prevented scurvy and other deficiency diseases. The timing of meals was also strategic. Vikings typically ate 2 main meals per day, one in the morning before starting work, and one in the evening after the day's labor was done. But they also snacked throughout the day on dried fish, cheese, and nuts, maintaining a steady intake of calories to fuel their internal furnaces. Drinks were equally important. Water was consumed, but it was often mixed with other ingredients to increase its caloric value. Milk, when available, was a primary beverage, but the most important drink was mead, fermented honey, and ale made from barley. These weren't just recreational beverages. They provided calories, warmth, and a psychological boost during the long, dark winter months. The preparation of food was a constant activity, especially for women who managed the household food supplies. Meat had to be butchered, preserved, and stored. Fish had to be cleaned, dried, and packed. Dairy had to be processed into butter and cheese. Grains had to be ground into flour. This wasn't just cooking. It was food engineering, a complex process that required knowledge, skill, and constant attention. Storage was another challenge. Vikings developed sophisticated techniques for keeping food safe through the winter. Root cellars, dug deep into the ground, maintained a constant cool temperature that prevented spoilage. Smokehouses preserved meat and fish. Salt, when available, was used to cure foods. And the cold itself was used as a natural refrigerator. Meat could be hung outside in winter and would freeze solid, remaining edible for months. But perhaps the most important aspect of Viking food culture was the communal nature of eating. Meals were social events, times when the entire household gathered around the fire to share food, stories, and warmth. This wasn't just about nutrition. It was about maintaining social bonds, sharing knowledge, and reinforcing the community ties that were essential for survival in such a harsh environment. Now we need to talk about something that doesn't get enough attention when discussing Viking survival: the psychological challenge of the long polar night. In the far north of Scandinavia, the sun doesn't just set early in winter, it disappears entirely for weeks or even months. This isn't just inconvenient, it's psychologically devastating. Modern science has a name for the depression and anxiety that can result from prolonged darkness: seasonal affective disorder. But the Vikings didn't have psychiatrists or light therapy boxes. What they had was a sophisticated understanding of human psychology and a set of cultural practices designed to maintain mental health through the darkest months. The first strategy was structure. Viking society maintained strict daily routines even when there was no sun to mark the passage of time. People woke at the same time, ate at the same time, worked at the same time, and slept at the same time. This regularity provided a sense of normalcy and control in an environment that could otherwise feel chaotic and disorienting. But structure alone wasn't enough. Vikings also understood the importance of light, not just for practical purposes, but for psychological well-being. The longhouse fire was never allowed to go out completely during winter. Even at night, embers were carefully banked to ensure that the fire could be quickly rekindled in the morning. This constant presence of light, however dim, provided a psychological anchor. Oil lamps and candles were used generously, despite the expense. Vikings understood that the cost of lighting was worth the benefit to mental health. Some households even had dedicated light keepers, usually children or elderly family members, whose job was to maintain the lamps and ensure that the house never fell into complete darkness. Social interaction was another crucial element. The long winter nights were filled with communal activities: storytelling, music, games, and crafts. These weren't just entertainment. They were deliberate strategies to maintain social bonds and prevent the isolation that could lead to depression and anxiety. Storytelling, in particular, played a vital role. The sagas, long, complex narratives of heroes, gods, and adventures, were recited from memory during the winter months. These stories served multiple purposes. They preserved cultural knowledge and history. They provided entertainment and distraction, and they created a shared experience that reinforced community identity. But the sagas also served a deeper psychological function. They reminded people that they were part of something larger than themselves, connected to a history that stretched back generations and would continue into the future. This sense of continuity and purpose was crucial for maintaining hope during the darkest months. Music was equally important. Vikings played a variety of instruments: lyres, flutes, drums, and singing was a common activity. Music has a powerful effect on mood and emotion, and Vikings understood this intuitively. Songs could lift spirits, express emotions, and create a sense of unity among listeners. Games provided another form of mental stimulation. Vikings played board games like Hnefatafel, a strategic game similar to chess. They played dice games, betting on outcomes and engaging in friendly competition. These games weren't just pastimes. They kept minds sharp and provided a sense of challenge and achievement during months when outdoor activities were limited. Crafts and handiwork also played a role. Women spun wool, wove fabric, and created intricate embroidery. Men carved wood, worked leather, and crafted tools. These activities provided a sense of productivity and accomplishment, countering the feelings of helplessness that could arise from being trapped indoors by the weather. But Vikings also recognized the importance of physical activity for mental health. Even in the coldest weather, people made efforts to get outside, to move, to engage with the environment. Short walks, wood chopping, animal care, these activities weren't just necessary chores. They were opportunities to break the monotony of indoor life and maintain physical and mental fitness. The sauna, or bathhouse, was another important institution. Vikings would heat stones until they were red hot, then pour water over them to create steam. The intense heat was followed by a plunge into cold water or snow. This practice wasn't just about cleanliness, it was a form of therapy, a way to shock the system, improve circulation, and create a sense of invigoration and renewal. Vikings also understood the importance of sleep, but they approached it differently than we do today. Rather than sleeping in one long block, they practiced what historians call segmented sleep, sleeping for a few hours, waking for a period of quiet activity, then sleeping again. This pattern, which seems strange to modern people, was actually well suited to the long winter nights and may have helped prevent the oversleeping and lethargy that can accompany seasonal depression. Diet also played a role in mental health. Vikings consumed foods rich in omega-3 fatty acids, fish in particular, which modern science has shown to be important for brain health and mood regulation. They also consumed fermented foods, which support gut health, and there's growing evidence that gut health is closely linked to mental health. But perhaps the most important psychological strategy was the Viking attitude toward winter itself. They didn't see it as something to be endured or survived. They saw it as a natural part of the cycle of life, a time for rest, reflection, and preparation for the coming spring. This acceptance, this refusal to fight against the inevitable, may have been their greatest psychological strength. Vikings also had a concept called sisu, a Finnish word that doesn't translate perfectly into English, but roughly means a combination of determination, resilience, and courage in the face of adversity. This wasn't just about physical toughness, it was a mental attitude, a refusal to give up even when circumstances seemed hopeless. This attitude was reinforced through cultural narratives and social expectations. Children were taught from a young age to be tough, to endure discomfort without complaint, to find strength in adversity. This wasn't cruelty. It was preparation for a life where mental resilience could mean the difference between survival and death. The community also provided support for those who struggled. Mental health issues weren't stigmatized in the way they often are today. If someone was suffering from what we might call depression or anxiety, the community rallied around them, providing support, companionship, and practical help. This social safety net was crucial for maintaining the mental health of the entire community. Let's shift our focus to transportation, because surviving the cold wasn't just about staying warm in one place. It was about maintaining mobility in an environment that seemed designed to prevent it. Vikings developed a range of technologies for moving across ice, snow, and frozen water that were centuries ahead of their time. Skis are the most obvious example. Archaeological evidence shows that Scandinavians were using skis as early as 6,000 years ago, but Vikings refined the technology to an art form. Viking skis weren't the sleek, lightweight equipment we use today. They were long, sometimes 8 to 10 feet, and made from single pieces of wood, usually pine or birch, carefully shaped and treated. But here's what's interesting. Vikings used two different types of skis simultaneously. The right ski was longer and designed for gliding, while the left ski was shorter and covered with fur or sealskin, providing grip for pushing off. This asymmetric design allowed for efficient movement across varied terrain. The long ski glided over flat areas, while the short ski provided traction for climbing hills. The bindings were simple but effective, leather straps that secured the foot while allowing the heel to lift. This design, remarkably similar to modern cross-country ski bindings, allowed for a natural walking motion while still providing control. Poles, made from wood and sometimes tipped with bone or antler, provided balance and additional propulsion. But skis were just one part of the winter transportation system. Sleds were equally important, and Viking sled design was remarkably sophisticated. The runners were made from hardwood, carefully shaped to reduce friction, and sometimes shod with bone or metal for durability. The sled body was constructed from lighter wood, often with a curved front that helped it ride over obstacles. What's really clever is how Vikings adapted their sleds for different purposes. Small hand sleds were used for transporting goods short distances. Larger sleds, pulled by horses or reindeer, could carry massive loads. And some sleds were designed specifically for transporting people, with enclosed bodies that provided protection from wind and snow. The harness systems for draft animals were also ingenious. Vikings developed specialized harnesses that distributed weight evenly across the animal's body, allowing it to pull heavy loads without injury. They understood the importance of proper fit and adjustment, and they developed techniques for training animals to work in winter conditions. Ice travel presented its own challenges. Vikings developed ice picks, spiked poles that could be used to test ice thickness and provide stability when crossing frozen lakes or rivers. They understood the dangers of thin ice and developed rules for safe travel. Never cross alone, always carry rope, test the ice frequently, and know the signs of weak spots. But perhaps the most impressive winter transportation technology was the ice boat, a sled fitted with a sail. On frozen lakes and rivers, these vessels could achieve remarkable speeds, using the wind to propel them across the ice. This wasn't just a novelty, it was a practical way to transport goods and people quickly across frozen waterways. Vikings also developed techniques for winter navigation that seem almost magical. Without compasses or GPS, they navigated across snow-covered landscapes using a combination of methods. They read the stars, of course, but they also used the sun's position even when it was hidden by clouds, observing the polarization of light through special crystals called sunstones. They read the landscape, memorizing landmarks and using subtle features, the shape of a hill, the pattern of trees, the direction of wind-sculpted snow, to maintain their bearings. They even used the behavior of animals, following reindeer trails or watching the flight patterns of birds to find the best routes. Winter roads were another innovation. Vikings would deliberately pack down snow to create hard, smooth surfaces for sled travel. These roads were maintained throughout the winter, with communities taking responsibility for keeping their sections clear and passable. In some areas, these winter roads were actually superior to summer roads, which could be muddy and difficult to traverse. Bridges and causeways were adapted for winter use. Wooden bridges that might be impassable in summer due to flooding could be easily crossed in winter when the water was frozen. Vikings also built temporary ice bridges, reinforcing natural ice formations with additional layers of water that would freeze, creating thick, stable crossing points. The maintenance of winter transportation equipment was a constant task. Skis had to be waxed with animal fat to improve glide and prevent snow from sticking. Sled runners had to be checked for damage and repaired. Harnesses had to be cleaned and conditioned to prevent cracking. This maintenance wasn't just about keeping equipment functional. It was about ensuring safety in an environment where equipment failure could be fatal. Now let's talk about something that might surprise you. The Viking economy didn't shut down in winter. In fact, in many ways, winter was the most economically productive time of year. This seems counterintuitive. How could people be productive when they were trapped indoors by cold and darkness? But Vikings had developed an economic system that was perfectly adapted to their environment. Winter was the primary time for craft production. With outdoor work limited by weather, people turned their attention to creating the goods that would be traded in the spring and summer. Blacksmiths worked in their forges, producing tools, weapons, and decorative items. Woodworkers carved everything from simple bowls to elaborate ship components. Leather workers created shoes, belts, and harnesses. Textile workers spun wool, wove fabric, and created clothing. This wasn't just busy work. It was a sophisticated production system that took advantage of the forced indoor time to create trade goods. A skilled craftsperson could produce enough goods during the winter months to support their family for the entire year. And because everyone was producing during the same period, there was a natural rhythm to the economy. Production in winter, trade in summer. But Vikings also engaged in winter trade, particularly in areas where frozen rivers and lakes created new transportation routes. Ice roads allowed for the movement of heavy goods that would be difficult to transport in summer. Timber, stone, and metal ores could be sledded across frozen waterways, opening up trade routes that were impassable during warmer months. Winter markets were held in some areas, taking advantage of the ice roads and the accumulated production of craft goods. These markets were social events as much as economic ones, providing opportunities for communities to gather, exchange news, and arrange marriages and alliances. The fur trade was particularly important in winter. This was the season when animal pelts were at their thickest and most valuable. Trappers would venture into the forests, setting snares and traps for foxes, martens, beavers, and other fur-bearing animals. These pelts were highly prized in warmer climates and formed a major export commodity. Fishing continued through the winter, but it took on a different form. Ice fishing was practiced extensively, with Vikings cutting holes in frozen lakes and rivers and using lines or nets to catch fish. The cold acted as a natural preservative, allowing fish to be stored frozen until they could be processed or traded. Hunting was another winter activity. While some animals hibernated or migrated, others remained active and could be hunted for meat and hides. Reindeer, elk, and wild boar were all hunted during winter months. The snow actually made hunting easier in some ways. Tracks were easy to follow, and wounded animals couldn't move as quickly through deep snow. But the winter economy wasn't just about production and trade. It was also about resource management. Vikings had to carefully manage their food stores, ensuring that supplies lasted through the winter without running out. This required sophisticated planning and accounting, with households keeping track of consumption rates and adjusting their usage based on how much winter remained. Lending and borrowing were common practices. If one household ran short of food, they could borrow from a neighbor, with the understanding that the debt would be repaid in the spring. This system of mutual aid was crucial for survival, but it also created economic relationships and obligations that extended beyond the immediate transaction. Winter was also the time for planning and negotiation. With outdoor work limited, people had time to discuss plans for the coming year. Farming strategies were debated, trading expeditions were organized, raids were planned, marriages were arranged. These discussions and negotiations were crucial for the functioning of Viking society, and winter provided the time and space for them to occur. The legal system also operated during winter. Thing meetings, assemblies where disputes were resolved and laws were made, were often held during winter months when people had time to travel and participate. These meetings were important not just for resolving conflicts, but for maintaining social cohesion and reinforcing community norms. Education and training also took place during winter. Children learned crafts from their parents and other skilled adults. Young men were trained in weapons use and combat techniques. Stories and traditions were passed down from elders to younger generations. This knowledge transfer was crucial for maintaining cultural continuity and ensuring that skills weren't lost. We need to talk about how Vikings understood the cold on a spiritual and mythological level, because their beliefs shaped their survival strategies in profound ways. The Norse cosmos wasn't a warm, welcoming place. It was born from ice and fire, and cold was woven into the very fabric of their understanding of existence. In Norse mythology, the world began in Ginnungagap, a vast void between the realm of fire, Muspelheim, and the realm of ice, Niflheim. When the heat from Muspelheim met the cold from Niflheim, the resulting interaction created the first living beings. Cold wasn't just a physical phenomenon, it was a primordial force, one of the fundamental elements of creation. The giants, the Jotnar, were often associated with cold and winter. These weren't the stupid, brutish giants of later fairy tales. They were powerful, intelligent beings who represented the wild, untamed forces of nature. Some giants were specifically associated with winter. Skadi, the goddess of winter and skiing, was a giantess who married into the Aesir, the primary pantheon of Norse gods. This association between giants and cold had practical implications. Vikings saw winter as a time when the forces of chaos and wildness were strongest, when the boundaries between the ordered world of humans and the wild world of nature became thin. This wasn't just superstition, it reflected the real dangers of winter, when storms could destroy homes, cold could kill, and the normal rules of life seemed suspended. But Vikings didn't see cold as purely evil or destructive. It was also associated with wisdom and endurance. Odin, the chief of the gods, was often depicted as a wanderer, who traveled through harsh conditions in pursuit of knowledge. His willingness to endure cold, hunger, and hardship was seen as a source of his wisdom and power. The concept of wired, often translated as fate or destiny, was central to Norse belief, and it had implications for how Vikings approached winter survival. Weird wasn't a predetermined future that couldn't be changed. It was more like the accumulated weight of past actions and circumstances that shaped what was possible in the present. Vikings believed that while they couldn't control the weather or prevent winter, they could influence their wired through their actions, by preparing properly, by maintaining social bonds, by showing courage and resilience. This belief system encouraged a proactive approach to survival. Rather than passively accepting whatever winter brought, Vikings actively worked to shape their circumstances. They prepared extensively, they helped each other, and they faced challenges with determination. This wasn't just practical, it was a spiritual practice, a way of demonstrating their worthiness and strength. Rituals and sacrifices were performed to ensure good fortune during winter. Offerings were made to the gods, particularly to Freyr, the god of fertility and prosperity, asking for mild weather and abundant food. The Midwinter Festival, which later became associated with Christmas, was originally a time of sacrifice and celebration, marking the turning point of winter when the days would begin to lengthen again. These rituals served multiple purposes. They provided a sense of control in an uncontrollable situation. They reinforced community bonds through shared participation. And they marked the passage of time, providing structure and meaning to the long winter months. The concept of honor was also tied to winter survival. A person who faced winter with courage, who helped their neighbors, who maintained their dignity even in hardship, was building their reputation and honor. Conversely, someone who complained excessively, who failed to prepare, or who abandoned their responsibilities, was seen as dishonorable. This social pressure to maintain honor was a powerful motivator. It encouraged people to endure hardship without complaint, to help others even when they were struggling themselves, and to maintain high standards of behavior even in difficult circumstances. This wasn't just about individual pride. It was about maintaining the social cohesion that was essential for collective survival. Dreams and omens were taken seriously, particularly during winter. Vikings believed that the veil between the physical and spiritual worlds was thinner during the dark months, and that dreams could provide guidance or warnings. A dream about spring might be interpreted as a sign that winter would be short. A dream about ice might warn of danger ahead. These beliefs weren't just superstition. They provided a framework for processing anxiety and uncertainty, for making sense of a world that often seemed chaotic and unpredictable. They also encouraged people to pay attention to subtle signs and patterns, which could have practical survival value. The afterlife beliefs of Vikings also influenced their approach to winter survival. Those who died in battle were said to go to Valhalla, Odin's hall, where they would feast and fight until Ragnarok. But what about those who died of cold or hunger? They went to Hell, a realm that wasn't necessarily punishment, but was certainly less glorious than Valhalla. This belief may have encouraged Vikings to take risks, to venture out in dangerous conditions, to fight against the cold rather than passively succumbing to it. A death from exposure might be inevitable, but it wasn't honorable in the same way as a death in battle. This cultural attitude may have pushed people to survive when others might have given up. Let's talk about Viking medicine, because surviving the cold meant dealing with a range of health challenges that would have killed people without proper treatment. Vikings didn't have modern medicine, but they had developed a sophisticated understanding of cold-related injuries and illnesses, along with effective treatments. Frostbite was a constant danger. Vikings understood that frostbite occurred when tissue froze, and they knew the signs: white or grayish skin, numbness, hard or waxy texture. Their treatment was remarkably effective. Gradual rewarming in lukewarm water, never hot water, which could cause additional damage. They understood that rubbing frostbitten tissue could cause harm, so they avoided this common mistake. For severe frostbite, Vikings used poultices made from various plants. Yarrow, a common herb, was applied to frostbitten areas to promote healing. Honey, with its natural antibacterial properties, was used to prevent infection. In some cases, they would lance blisters and drain fluid, a procedure that required skill and knowledge to avoid causing further damage. Hypothermia was another major threat. Vikings recognized the signs: shivering, confusion, slurred speech, loss of coordination. Their treatment focused on gradual rewarming, using body heat from other people, warm drinks, and careful placement near fires. They understood that rapid rewarming could be dangerous, causing shock or heart problems. But Vikings also practiced preventive medicine. They understood that staying dry was crucial for preventing hypothermia, so they developed techniques for drying wet clothing quickly. They knew that alcohol, despite making you feel warm, actually increased heat loss, so they avoided drinking before going out in extreme cold. Respiratory illnesses were common during winter, when people were crowded together in poorly ventilated spaces. Vikings used steam inhalation, often with added herbs like pine or eucalyptus, to treat congestion and coughs. They made syrups from honey and various plants to soothe sore throats and suppress coughs. For more serious respiratory infections, they used a combination of treatments. Mustard plasters applied to the chest helped break up congestion. Herbal teas made from elderflower, thyme, or other plants had antimicrobial properties. And they understood the importance of rest and nutrition in fighting off infections. Vitamin deficiency was a real concern during winter, when fresh fruits and vegetables were unavailable. Scurvy, caused by vitamin C deficiency, could be devastating. Vikings prevented this by consuming preserved berries, particularly lingonberries and cloudberries, which retained their vitamin C content even when dried or preserved in honey. They also ate fresh spruce tips when available, which are rich in vitamin C. Bone fractures and other injuries were treated with surprising sophistication. Vikings could set broken bones, using splints made from wood or bark to immobilize the injury while it healed. They understood the importance of alignment and used traction techniques to ensure bones healed properly. For wounds, Vikings practiced what we would now call antiseptic technique. They cleaned wounds with water, sometimes boiled first to kill bacteria, though they didn't understand the mechanism. They used honey as a wound dressing, which we now know has antibacterial properties. They also used certain plants like plantain and comfrey, which promote healing. Pain management was another area where Vikings showed medical sophistication. They used willow bark, which contains salicin, a compound similar to aspirin, to reduce pain and inflammation. They used poppy seeds, which contain small amounts of opiates for more severe pain, and they used alcohol, both as an anesthetic for procedures and as a pain reliever. Mental health was also addressed, though not in the way we might expect. Vikings recognized that winter could cause what they called winter sickness, what we would now call seasonal affective disorder. Their treatment focused on maintaining social connections, staying active, and ensuring adequate light exposure. They also used certain herbs like St. John's wort, which modern research has shown can be effective for mild to moderate depression. Childbirth during winter presented special challenges. Vikings had skilled midwives who understood the process of labor and delivery. They used various techniques to manage pain and complications, including herbal remedies, massage, and positioning. The warm environment of the longhouse was actually beneficial for childbirth, providing a clean, controlled space. But infant mortality was high, particularly during winter. Vikings understood that newborns were especially vulnerable to cold and took special precautions. Babies were kept close to their mothers for warmth, often sleeping in the same bed. They were wrapped in soft wool and kept near the fire, and they were breastfed frequently, which provided both nutrition and warmth. The elderly also required special care during winter. Vikings recognized that older people were more vulnerable to cold and illness. They were given the warmest spots in the longhouse, the best food, and extra attention. This wasn't just compassion. It was recognition of the value of elders' knowledge and experience. Vikings also practiced what we might call public health measures. They understood that crowding increased the spread of disease, so they maintained good ventilation in their homes despite the cold. They practiced basic hygiene, washing hands and bodies regularly in the sauna, and they isolated sick individuals when possible to prevent the spread of contagious diseases. Winter wasn't just a physical challenge, it was a political one. The long months of cold and darkness tested the social structures that held Viking communities together, and the way power was exercised and maintained during winter reveals much about Viking political sophistication. The thing system, the assembly where free men gathered to make laws and settle disputes, operated differently in winter. While summer things were large gatherings that might include representatives from many communities, winter things were smaller, more local affairs. But they were no less important. Winter was when many disputes were resolved, when marriages were arranged, when alliances were formed or broken. The timing of winter things was strategic. They were held during breaks in the weather when travel was possible, but outdoor work was still limited. This ensured maximum participation while not interfering with essential survival activities. The location was also carefully chosen, usually a central place that was accessible to all community members, often a large longhouse that could accommodate the assembly. Leadership during winter required different skills than leadership during summer. A good summer leader might be a skilled warrior or sailor, someone who could lead raids or trading expeditions, but a good winter leader needed to be a manager, someone who could resolve conflicts, allocate resources fairly, and maintain morale during the long, dark months. The role of the Jarl, or chieftain, was particularly important during winter. The Jarl was responsible for ensuring that the community had adequate food stores, that the vulnerable were cared for, and that disputes were resolved before they escalated into violence. A Jarl who failed in these responsibilities could lose the support of his followers, and in extreme cases could be replaced. But Viking political power wasn't absolute. It was based on reciprocity and mutual obligation. A Jarl provided protection, resources, and leadership, but in return, he expected loyalty, military service, and support. This relationship was tested during winter, when resources were scarce and tensions could run high. The distribution of food during winter was a political act. A generous Jarl who shared his stores freely would gain loyalty and respect. A stingy Jarl who hoarded resources while his people starved would lose support. This created a powerful incentive for leaders to maintain adequate stores and to distribute them fairly. Feasts played an important political role during winter. These weren't just celebrations. They were demonstrations of wealth and power, opportunities to reinforce social bonds, and occasions for political maneuvering. A Jarl who could host a lavish feast in the middle of winter was showing that he had the resources and organizational skills to take care of his people. But feasts were also opportunities for challenges to authority. The drinking, boasting, and competitive games that characterized Viking feasts could lead to conflicts. Insults might be exchanged, old grievances aired, challenges issued. A skilled leader had to navigate these situations carefully, maintaining order without appearing weak or tyrannical. Women played important political roles during winter, though these are often overlooked in historical accounts. The lady of the household managed the food stores, organized the work of spinning and weaving, and often acted as a mediator in disputes. In the absence of her husband, she might manage the entire estate, making decisions about resource allocation and conflict resolution. Some women held formal political power. Shield maidens, though rare, were recognized warriors who could participate in things and hold property. Wealthy widows could inherit their husbands' estates and wield considerable influence. And Völvas, female seers and practitioners of magic, were consulted on important decisions and treated with respect and sometimes fear. The treatment of slaves during winter reveals the complexities of Viking social structure. Slaves, or thralls, were at the bottom of the social hierarchy, but they were also valuable property. A slave who died of cold or hunger represented a significant economic loss. This created an incentive to provide at least minimal care, though conditions were undoubtedly harsh. Some slaves could earn their freedom through years of service, and winter was often when these negotiations took place. A slave who had proven their value might be offered freedom in exchange for continued service or a payment. These transactions were formalized at thing meetings, becoming part of the legal record. Alliances between communities were particularly important during winter. If one community faced a shortage of food, they might seek help from neighbors. These requests created obligations that would need to be repaid, often with interest. Over time, these exchanges built networks of mutual support that extended across large regions. But winter could also be a time of conflict. Disputes over resources, boundaries, or honor that had simmered during summer might come to a head during the long winter months. These conflicts could escalate into feuds that lasted for generations, with each side seeking revenge for perceived wrongs. The legal system provided mechanisms for resolving these disputes without violence. Compensation could be paid for injuries or insults. Oaths could be sworn to settle disagreements. And in extreme cases, outlawry, banishment from the community, could be imposed on those who violated social norms. But the threat of violence was always present. A man who felt his honor had been insulted might challenge his opponent to a duel, to be fought in the spring when conditions allowed. These challenges were taken seriously, and the anticipation of the coming fight could dominate the winter months. Let's talk about something that might seem counterintuitive. Vikings didn't stop fighting in winter. In fact, winter warfare was a crucial part of their military strategy, and they developed tactics and technologies specifically designed for combat in cold conditions. The first advantage of winter warfare was mobility. Frozen rivers and lakes became highways, allowing armies to move quickly across terrain that would be impassable in summer. A Viking force could travel on ice, bypassing defensive positions and striking at unexpected locations. This mobility gave them a significant tactical advantage over enemies who were less adapted to winter conditions. Skis and sleds allowed Viking warriors to move quickly and quietly across snow-covered ground. A raiding party on skis could cover vast distances in a single night, striking at dawn when their enemies were least prepared. The snow muffled sound, making it difficult for sentries to detect approaching forces. But winter warfare also presented challenges. Weapons and armor had to be adapted for cold conditions. Metal became brittle in extreme cold, so swords and axes had to be made from specially treated steel that could withstand low temperatures. Bowstrings made from animal sinew could freeze and snap, so archers had to keep their bows warm and dry. Armor was a particular problem. Metal armor conducted cold, making it uncomfortable and potentially dangerous to wear. Vikings solved this by wearing thick padding underneath their armor, creating an insulating layer. They also used leather and fur armor, which provided protection while retaining warmth. Shields, typically made from wood, could become brittle in cold weather. Vikings addressed this by treating their shields with oils and fats, which helped maintain flexibility. They also carried spare shields, knowing that breakage was more likely in winter combat. The tactics of winter warfare were different from summer campaigns. Sieges were rare. It was difficult to maintain a siege in winter, when both attackers and defenders faced the challenge of staying warm and fed. Instead, winter warfare focused on raids, quick strikes designed to capture resources, take prisoners, or eliminate specific targets. Ambushes were particularly effective in winter. A force could hide in a snowbank or behind a ridge, invisible until the moment of attack. The snow-dampened sound making it difficult for the enemy to hear approaching danger, and the cold slowed reaction times, giving the attackers a crucial advantage. But winter warfare also required careful planning. An army couldn't live off the land in winter. There was nothing to forage. This meant that winter campaigns had to be short, or the army had to carry all its supplies. Vikings developed sophisticated logistics systems, using sleds to transport food, weapons, and other necessities. The psychological impact of winter warfare was significant. An enemy who thought they were safe behind frozen rivers and snow-covered mountains would be shocked to find Viking warriors at their gates. This surprise factor was a powerful weapon, often causing panic and disorganization among defenders. But Vikings also faced the risk of being caught in winter storms. A sudden blizzard could trap an army in the open, leading to catastrophic losses. Viking commanders had to be skilled at reading weather signs and making quick decisions about when to advance and when to seek shelter. Winter camps were carefully constructed to provide maximum protection. Vikings would dig into snowbanks, creating shelters that were insulated by the snow itself. They would build windbreaks from branches and hides, and they would maintain fires constantly, knowing that a fire that went out could mean death for the entire camp. The treatment of prisoners during winter campaigns was pragmatic. Prisoners were valuable. They could be ransomed or sold as slaves, but they were also a burden. They had to be fed, guarded, and kept alive in harsh conditions. Vikings developed systems for managing prisoners efficiently, often forcing them to carry supplies or perform other useful tasks. Naval warfare continued in winter, though in a different form. Vikings would sometimes attack coastal settlements in winter, when defenders assumed they were safe from seaborne raids. Ships could be dragged across ice or sailed through channels in the ice, allowing for surprise attacks. But winter naval warfare was extremely dangerous. Ice could damage ships, trapping them or crushing their hulls. Crews faced the constant risk of falling through thin ice or being caught in sudden storms. Only the most skilled and daring captains attempted winter voyages. The end of winter campaigns was often determined by weather rather than military considerations. As spring approached and ice began to melt, armies had to retreat or risk being cut off from their bases. This created a natural rhythm to winter warfare. Campaigns began after the ice was solid enough to support movement, and ended before the spring thaw made travel impossible. Now we need to talk about how the Viking experience of cold shaped not just their own culture, but the entire course of European and even world history. Because the strategies they developed for surviving extreme cold gave them advantages that extended far beyond simple survival. The Viking expansion, the raids, trading expeditions, and settlements that spread Norse influence from North America to the Middle East, was made possible by their cold weather adaptations. While other European peoples were limited by seasonal weather patterns, Vikings could operate year-round. This gave them a strategic advantage that they exploited ruthlessly. The settlement of Iceland, beginning in 874 CE, was a direct result of Viking cold weather expertise. Iceland was even more hostile than Scandinavia, colder, darker, more isolated. But Vikings saw it as an opportunity, rather than a challenge. They applied the survival strategies they had developed at home, adapting them to an even harsher environment. The Icelandic settlement was remarkably successful. Within a few generations, Iceland had a thriving population, a sophisticated legal system, and a rich literary culture. The sagas, those great works of medieval literature, were written in Iceland by people whose ancestors had mastered the art of surviving in one of the coldest inhabited places on Earth. The settlement of Greenland, beginning in 985 CE, pushed Viking cold weather adaptation even further. Greenland was colder than Iceland, with less arable land and more extreme conditions. But Vikings established settlements that lasted for nearly 500 years, surviving through a combination of farming, hunting, and trade. The Greenland settlements eventually failed, probably due to a combination of climate change, economic isolation, and conflict with indigenous peoples. But for centuries, they represented the northernmost European settlements in the world, a testament to Viking resilience and adaptability. The Viking discovery of North America, around 1000 CE, was the culmination of their cold weather expansion. Leif Erikson and his crew sailed across the North Atlantic, navigating through ice and storms to reach what they called Vinland. The settlement they established in Newfoundland was short-lived, but it represented an extraordinary achievement, Europeans reaching the Americas 500 years before Columbus. This achievement was only possible because of Viking cold weather expertise. The ships they used were designed to handle ice and cold water. The clothing and equipment they carried were adapted for extreme conditions. And the mental toughness they had developed through generations of surviving Scandinavian winters gave them the resilience to endure the hardships of transatlantic exploration. But the Viking legacy extends beyond exploration and settlement. The technologies they developed for cold weather survival influenced later European cultures. Ski technology, refined by Vikings, spread throughout northern Europe, and eventually became a crucial military tool. The Norwegian army used skis extensively in winter warfare, a tradition that continues to this day. Viking ship design, adapted for cold water sailing, influenced the development of later European vessels. The clinker-built construction, the flexible hull design, the sophisticated rigging, all of these features can be traced back to Viking innovations driven by the need to operate in harsh northern waters. The Viking approach to community and mutual aid, developed as a survival strategy in a harsh environment, influenced the development of Scandinavian social structures. The emphasis on cooperation, the systems of mutual obligation, the relatively egalitarian social structures, these features of modern Scandinavian societies have deep roots in Viking-age survival strategies. Even Viking mythology and literature, shaped by the experience of cold and darkness, left a lasting legacy. The Norse gods, with their emphasis on courage, endurance, and acceptance of fate, reflected the values necessary for survival in a harsh environment. These stories influenced later European literature and continue to resonate in modern culture. The Viking experience also offers lessons for modern people facing climate challenges. As we grapple with climate change and the possibility of more extreme weather events, the Viking example shows that humans can adapt to harsh conditions through a combination of technology, social organization, and mental resilience. Vikings didn't just survive the cold, they thrived in it. They built a civilization that lasted for centuries, that spread across vast distances, that left a cultural legacy that endures to this day. They did this not by fighting against their environment, but by understanding it, adapting to it, and ultimately using it to their advantage. The key to their success wasn't any single technology or strategy. It was a holistic approach that integrated physical adaptations, social structures, psychological resilience, and cultural values. They understood that survival in extreme conditions required more than just warm clothing or adequate food. It required a complete reimagining of how humans could live. Modern survival experts often talk about the rule of threes. You can survive 3 minutes without air, 3 hours without shelter in extreme conditions, 3 days without water, 3 weeks without food. Vikings understood these principles intuitively, and they built their entire society around ensuring that these basic needs were met, even in the harshest conditions. But they also understood something that modern survival training sometimes overlooks: the importance of meaning and purpose. Vikings didn't just survive for the sake of survival. They survived to build, to explore, to create, to leave a legacy. This sense of purpose, this connection to something larger than themselves, may have been their greatest survival tool. So here we are at the end of our journey through the frozen world of the Vikings. We've explored their environment, their technologies, their social structures, their beliefs. We've seen how they adapted every aspect of their lives to survive in conditions that would kill most modern people within hours. But the most important lesson isn't about any specific technique or technology, it's about mindset. Vikings survived the deadliest cold on Earth because they refused to see themselves as victims of their environment. They saw themselves as masters of it. They didn't wait for someone to save them. They didn't complain about the unfairness of their situation. They didn't waste energy wishing things were different. They simply looked at the reality they faced and asked, how do we make this work? This pragmatic, problem-solving approach was applied to every challenge. Cold? Develop better clothing. Darkness? Create social structures that maintain mental health. Food scarcity? Develop preservation techniques and storage systems. Isolation? Build ships that can navigate frozen seas. But they also understood that survival wasn't just an individual challenge, it was a collective one. The elaborate systems of mutual aid, the emphasis on community, the willingness to share resources, these weren't just nice ideas. They were survival necessities. In the Viking world, you survived together or you died alone. The psychological dimension was equally important. Vikings developed a mental toughness that allowed them to endure hardship without breaking. But this wasn't just about gritting your teeth and pushing through. It was about finding meaning in the struggle, about seeing challenges as opportunities for growth, about maintaining hope even in the darkest times. Their mythology reflected this attitude. The Norse gods weren't all-powerful beings who could solve every problem. They were flawed, struggling figures who faced their own challenges and sometimes failed. But they kept fighting, kept striving, kept moving forward. This was the model Vikings aspired to. Not perfection, but persistence. The Viking approach to cold weather survival offers lessons that extend far beyond the specific challenge of staying warm. It's a template for facing any extreme challenge, environmental, social, personal. The principles are the same. Understand your environment, adapt your strategies, build strong communities, maintain mental resilience, and never give up. In our modern world, we face different challenges than the Vikings did. Climate change, economic uncertainty, social fragmentation, technological disruption. These are the harsh environments we must navigate. But the Viking example shows us that humans are capable of extraordinary adaptation when we combine practical innovation with social cooperation and mental toughness. We don't need to romanticize the Vikings or pretend their world was better than ours. It wasn't. Life was hard, short, and often brutal. But they faced their challenges with courage, creativity, and determination. They didn't just survive, they built a civilization that changed the world. So the next time you're facing a challenge that seems insurmountable, remember the Vikings. Remember that humans have survived and thrived in conditions far harsher than anything most of us will ever face. Remember that the key to survival isn't just physical preparation. It's mental resilience, social cooperation, and a refusal to give up. The Vikings survived the deadliest cold on Earth not because they were superhuman, but because they were fully human. They used every tool available to them, technology, community, culture, belief, to transform a hostile environment into a home. They turned winter from an enemy into an ally, from a threat into an opportunity. And in doing so, they left us a legacy that extends far beyond their specific survival techniques. They showed us that humans are capable of adapting to almost any environment, of thriving in the face of extreme challenges, of building meaning and purpose even in the harshest conditions. The cold that should have killed them instead made them stronger. The darkness that should have driven them mad instead taught them patience and community. The isolation that should have broken them instead forged them into one of history's most successful civilizations. That's the real story of how Vikings survived the deadliest cold on Earth, not through any single trick or technology, but through a complete reimagining of what it means to be human in an extreme environment. They didn't just endure the cold, they mastered it, weaponized it, and used it to reshape the medieval world. And on the coldest nights, when the wind howls and the darkness presses in, their legacy still whispers to us across the centuries, "You are stronger than you think. You can adapt to more than you imagine. And with courage, community, and determination, you can survive anything." The Vikings proved it. And their story, told around fires for over 1,000 years, continues to inspire us today.